I was slicing apples for the pie when my daughter pressed a sealed envelope into my palm and whispered, "Mom, please don't read this until after dinner." Then she looked over her shoulder toward the driveway where her husband was unloading the cooler and added softer, "Please don't tell him." The paper felt heavy, like it had bones. I tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan and heard the front door open and the grandchildren stampede in with the kind of joy that forgives every adult mistake. My daughter smiled in that brittle way you learn from years of holding your breath, and I knew the envelope would not wait until dessert. I knew because the last time she looked at me like that she was 8 and hiding a bloody knee behind her school project. I finished the apples with hands that were suddenly clumsy, sprinkled cinnamon like snow on a forecast I could not control, slid the pie into the oven, and told myself I could carry a secret for 3 hours. I told myself I have been a mother longer than I have been anything else and mothers hold, but as I set the timer my thumb found the edge of the envelope and my whole body knew we were not talking about a scraped knee. The house filled with the sounds of Sunday, football murmuring from the living room, the kettle complaining on the stove, my son-in-law laughing too loudly at something my son said. In the hallway my daughter took off her coat and hung it with a careful hand as if even the fabric needed soothing. I watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear and force herself to join the noise. She had always been the diplomat in our family, the child who made peace between siblings, between cousins, between me and her father when grief tried to turn us into our worst selves. She once arranged a garage sale to pay for a neighbor's dog surgery when the adults were too proud to ask for help. She is 34 now, and the world does not hand out gold stars for soft skills. It hands out bills and deadlines and long silences at the foot of the bed. I stirred the gravy and told myself I would open the envelope after Grace when the kids ran to the backyard and the men argued about the quarterback. I told myself I would read it quickly in the laundry room like a teenager with a note, then put it back before anyone noticed my hands shaking. We sat down at the table beneath the chandelier my husband insisted on installing himself in 1997. He bowed his head to say grace, and my granddaughter peeked under one eyelid to see if anyone was cheating. "Amen," said the room, and forks began. My son-in-law took 2 rolls. My son passed the green beans. My daughter smiled at each of them like a hostess paid by the hour. I watched her plate and saw that it was mostly salad. I have learned a few things about women trying to control something when life won't be controlled. I put a piece of turkey on her plate anyway, and she nodded thanks like a soldier accepts marching orders. The conversation roamed to school projects and property taxes and the neighbor's new fence. It was the kind of harmless talk that keeps families from drowning. After 20 minutes, the children asked to be excused, and I sent them out with mittens and a promise of pie. The men drifted toward the game and the kitchen side into the part of the afternoon where dishes clink and women talk in codes. My daughter stood with her back to the sink and stared at her phone like it might either save or end her. I took a breath and said, "Let's fold laundry," code for privacy in our house since 2003. In the laundry room, the dryer hummed like a small animal with a warm belly. I handed her a towel and began folding the way I have folded through deaths and births and job losses. The envelope sat heavy in my pocket like a stone in a boat. She said, "You can open it now," and I did. I slid a butter knife under the flap because tearing felt like violence. Inside was a cashier's check copy for $30,000, a receipt for a wire transfer to a private clinic in another state, and a typed note that said intake scheduled for Tuesday under the name A. Walker, my daughter's maiden initial and a last name that wasn't ours. I blinked slow. The way you do when a doctor says a word your mouth doesn't know how to hold. I looked up and she was already crying quiet tears that make no sound because they have traveled so far inside your chest before they reach your eyes. She said, "Don't be mad." I said, "I'm not mad. I am scared." She nodded like a person who has rehearsed worse reactions and found this one blessed. I said, "What is this?" She said, "It is either my last mistake or my first brave thing." She sat on the dryer lid and wrapped her arms around herself like a lifeguard in a storm. She said, "I'm pregnant, Mom," and the floor tilted under my shoes even though I was standing still. Pregnant is a soft word when you are 22 and the world is your cosigner. Pregnant at 34 with 2 kids and a mortgage and a husband still paying off a degree is a word that carries furniture. She said, "We did not plan it." You know we are barely keeping up as it is. Daycare is a second rent. He just got promoted, but the raise evaporated into insurance premiums. Our car sounds like a coughing moose. I laughed at the image, because that is what we do in our family when the ship tilts. She handed me a crumpled printout from the clinic, the kind everyone swears they never looked up. It used language designed to be clinical and merciful at once. She said Tuesday is for a procedure, and my heart climbed into my throat because Tuesday is also for soccer practice and piano and all the ordinary things that make up a life we call decent. I said, does he know? And that was the real question sneaking on little cat feet between the washers. She shook her head no. The moral dilemma sat down on the pile of warm towels and stared at me. My daughter asked me to keep a secret from her husband, a man I like, a man who eats my food with gratitude and fixes my porch steps without asking, a man who has been good to my daughter in 1,000 ways that do not make a movie. She was asking me to stand between them and hold a door shut long enough for her to do something he might never forgive. She was also asking me to remember who she is, the girl who rescued the neighbor's dog, the woman who schedules everyone's dentist appointments and pretends she likes doing it, the person who has learned to swallow her own needs. Until they dissolve, I looked at the check copy and the wire receipt and the false name, and I saw not only fear but a plan made by someone who is tired of being the last person considered in her own life. My mother's voice rose up from somewhere, saying, "Don't mistake politeness for consent." I nodded to the ghost, and to my living child, I said, "Tell me everything." She told me about the positive test in a grocery store bathroom because she couldn't wait until she got home. She told me about sitting in her minivan and watching the rain make the windshield look like bad television while she counted the months on her fingers and realized how many $1,000 those months would cost. She told me about my son-in-law working evenings since the promotion because with every rung he climbs the ladder cuts into his ribs a little deeper. She told me about doing the math on napkins and receipts and the back of the children's homework and how every version ended with their budget as a crime scene. She told me about calling clinics and being put on hold and hanging up because she didn't want her phone to know. She told me about the sleepless nights and the quiet decision she made at 3 in the morning when the house was finally quiet and she could hear her own reasons. She said, "I cannot add another child to a life where I already have to schedule my tears." She said he wants a third someday, but someday is the word we use to unload today's burden onto a future that may never arrive. She said if I tell him now he will say we can make it work because he always believes we can, and I will break under the weight of being the one who knows we can't. She said please don't tell him because I need one person to choose me. I folded a towel into the cleanest rectangle I could and put it on the shelf like an anchor. I said I will not lie to him, but I will not ambush him either. I said you are asking me to keep a secret long enough for you to do something he might hate you for. She said yes. She said I will tell him afterward. I will tell him that I could not carry his optimism one more mile, that I needed an hour in my life where I made a decision that did not require a committee. And I will carry the consequences like a woman who knows the difference between guilt and grief. She said, but I need to do it, and I need my mother to let me. The dryer clicked off and the quiet that followed felt like the space between heartbeats on a monitor. I could hear the game in the other room, a door opening, the dog's collar jingling, the small sounds of a family that does not yet know it is standing at a border. I thought about the years I had spent telling my daughter to speak up, to ask for raises, to split bedtime duty evenly, to stop apologizing for the sound of her own footsteps. I also thought about the vows she had made to the man in the living room. Vows I had watched with pride and a little envy because their wedding had better music than ours. I thought about the children who call me Nana and ask for extra whipped cream and believe the adults are railings they can hang from without falling. I thought about my own mother, who kept every secret anyone handed her until there was no room left in the house for furniture. My mother thought she was saving us from weather, but she was building a storm cellar and living in it. I promised myself at 30 I would not be her, and at 50 I would not be a saint who watches her daughter drown in decorum. I looked at my daughter and saw not only the child I raised, but the woman who has a right to choose her own suffering. I said I will take you. Tuesday, she closed her eyes the way a person does when the painkiller finally starts to work. She said thank you, and then she said I will tell him afterward. I don't need your permission to do this. I need your courage to sit next to me while I do. We stood there in the little room where clothes become themselves again, and I held her while she cried into my shoulder and apologized for my sweater, and I said I can wash sweaters. I have washed worse. Then I told her what I would require in exchange for my silence until Tuesday. I said you must tell him within 48 hours after the appointment. I said you must let me sit with you when you tell him if you want. I said you must talk to a counselor so you know which parts of the sadness belong to the decision and which parts belong to the world that made this your best option. I said you will not do this alone and you will not hate yourself for needing to. She nodded like a person signing a treaty that is not perfect but ends a war. I tucked the receipt and check copy back into the envelope and slid it under the sweaters on the top shelf. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is hide something from the wrong time. We walked back into the kitchen, and my son-in-law asked where the towels were, and I handed him one, and he kissed my daughter's cheek without looking at her because men often love in motion. Later, I pulled the pie from the oven, and the room filled with a smell that makes even bad decisions quieter for a minute. The children ran in with cold noses and rosy cheeks. We ate pie with too much whipped cream, and my son-in-law said we should plan a family beach trip next summer, and my daughter nodded and smiled, and her eyes turned to mine for a second, and I did not flinch. I took our family photo in front of the fireplace and told myself I was taking a picture of a bridge. Not a lie. That night after they left and the dishwasher hissed and clicked its way toward clean, my husband asked what was wrong. I said our daughter is carrying something heavy and I am helping her lift it. He said, do I need to lift too? And I said soon. He knows me well enough not to push when my voice goes like that. We played 2 hands of gin rummy and he won both because my head was elsewhere. I lay in bed and watched the ceiling fan make arguments with the air, and I asked the dark a question that mothers have been asking since we learned to keep papers in drawers. Do I belong first to my child or to the truth that will keep her marriage from becoming a story people whisper about? The answer refused to come. Like the name of the actor in a movie you know until you stop trying. On Tuesday, I drove her to the clinic 2 towns over where nobody knows us. The waiting room was beige in a way that tried not to offend. There were 2 other women and 1 man with a book. The receptionist spoke with the careful brightness of someone who knows words can bruise. My daughter filled out forms with the false name, and I hated the small deceit and loved the shield it made. She held my hand, and I told her the joke about the time she hid a frog in her lunchbox in 2nd grade, and the teacher screamed, and we were almost famous. They called her name, and she squeezed twice. I squeezed back twice. Our family code for I am here and I am here. She walked through the door, and the clock forgot how to move. I read a pamphlet about grief like it was a map to a country I had visited before and did not want to live in. When she came back, her face was clean and empty, and then suddenly not. We cried in the car and then laughed because my wipers squeaked. We drove to a diner and ate eggs we did not want because eating is what women do to make the world resume. That evening, true to the treaty we had written on the dryer, she told her husband. She asked me to sit in the next room because she wanted to say it with her own mouth, but she wanted my presence to keep the floor from falling. I sat with the dog and listened to the rise and fall of voices that had promised better and then found themselves human. There was a long silence that felt like a held breath, then the sound of 2 people deciding not to slam a door. He left for a walk. She came into the living room and sat beside me like a child again, and also very much not. She said, he is angry. He is hurt. He said we could have figured it out. I said he is allowed that. She nodded. She said he also said he loves me. He said he will not leave over one decision. He said he wishes I had trusted his hope. I said, and you said. She said, I said I trusted my limits, and for the first time all week I felt something like air return to my lungs. The next 3 days were a geography lesson in a country where the roads keep changing. My son-in-law did not speak to me at first because I had been the custodian of a secret, and in America we hate gatekeepers unless they keep other people's gates. On the 4th day he came by and asked me to walk. We moved slowly down the block like old conspirators. He said, I don't know how to be mad at you and love you at the same time. I said, you don't have to pick. People our age can hold 2 things without dropping either. He said I wanted another child. I said I know. He said, I also don't want to watch my wife vanish under the weight of my wanting. I said, then you will have to become the kind of man who measures his dreams against her oxygen levels. He nodded like a student who just realized the exam is about something else. He said, thank you for being with her. I said, thank you for planning to stay. 2 months later, they started counseling. He changed his schedule one night a week. She would join the choir on Thursdays. They made a spreadsheet like modern marriages do. But this time, instead of numbers, they listed the parts of their lives they were willing to trade. He gave up his gym membership for jogging with the stroller. She gave up saying yes to every volunteer sign-up at school. They both gave up the fiction that love solves math. In quieter moments, she cried for the baby who did not join our table, and I cried with her because being pro-choice and pro-grief are not mutually exclusive. And he cried alone sometimes on our back porch, and then came back in and washed the dishes like a vow. I am telling you this because we make stories too clean, and then we resent our lives for being messy. The moral dilemma was not solved by a speech or a single good manly hug. It softened into decisions repeated until they became a kind of truth. I still wonder if I did the right thing by keeping the secret until Tuesday. Sometimes in the grocery store, I see a woman with a third child in her cart, and I feel a twinge that is not jealousy and not relief, but a cousin of both. Then my granddaughter asks if she can have the cereal with the cartoon owl, and I say yes, even though it is mostly sugar, because sometimes mothering is measured in small permissions, and then I go home and make soup. For a family that is still learning where to put its bowls. I will end with a question I asked myself in the laundry room while the dryer cooled. If your grown child put a secret in your hand and asked you to hold it long enough for her to make a decision her spouse might never forgive, would you keep it to protect her autonomy, or would you tell to protect the marriage? Would you prioritize the person you raised or the family you helped her build, and when you choose, because you must? What would you want your grandchildren to learn about love from the way the adults at their table handled the truth when it arrived in an unmarked envelope?